General Hospital spoilers reveal that Curtis and Michael had passed the point of no return. What began as private doubts, as quiet exchanges of concern in dark corners of Port Charles, had now transformed into a coordinated and deliberate mission. They weren't just curious anymore, and they certainly weren't afraid. They were angry, sharp, calculating, and absolutely unified in their goal. And that goal was simple: destroy Drew. Not delay him. Not reason with him. Not negotiate terms of peace. No, those days were over. This was now about annihilation. This was about accountability. And it was about ensuring that every deceit, every manipulation, every crime Drew had committed, both in the shadows and in plain sight, was dragged into the light where it could no longer be ignored, excused, or concealed. They had chosen their timeline carefully. Curtis, having spent months collecting fragments of Drew's behavior, some hidden, some horrifyingly public, finally shared everything with Michael. The truth had been corrosive. Curtis had known that Drew was reckless, but he hadn't realized how far Drew had fallen into amorality until he looked at the full picture. In Germany, Drew hadn't been a man recovering from trauma, he had been building a network of control. He had manipulated, blackmailed, and coerced those around him to serve his ambitions. He had used Portia, twisted her fears and regrets into leverage. He had hired Felicia under the pretense of a favor, but in truth, he had weaponized her skills to track down Jacinda, knowing she held secrets that could ruin him, or anyone else he chose. Curtis had watched it all unravel, and the only thing worse than the actions themselves was Drew's absolute lack of remorse. Michael had been slow to act at first. He had given Drew the benefit of the doubt more times than he could count. But that changed the day he learned that Drew had paid off the hotel receptionist in Germany, the very person who could have reunited Michael and Willow during her most vulnerable days. Drew had ensured that Willow believed Michael didn't want to see her. He had deliberately kept them apart. He had taken advantage of her illness, her isolation, and twisted it into opportunity. Michael's rage had been instant. But it had also been focused. He wouldn't make a scene. He wouldn't lash out recklessly. He would plan. He would gather proof. And when the time was right, he would strike with surgical precision. Now, that time had come. The plan was methodical. They would begin with a quiet leak, subtle enough to draw attention, calculated enough to raise questions. Curtis had reached out to several trusted reporters in Port Charles, giving them just enough to stir curiosity, whispers of Drew's past in Germany, unverified but compelling. Meanwhile, Michael made contact with Tracy, pressing her to release the video footage of Drew and Cody at Brown Dog. At first, she was hesitant. Tracy had her own reasons for holding on to her secrets, but after hearing everything Drew had done, after being reminded of his betrayal and duplicity, she agreed. She handed over the footage. It showed Drew not only in a compromising state of mind but behaving erratically, under the influence of ketamine, a substance no sitting senator should ever be linked to. It was the kind of material that couldn't be explained away. It would raise questions not just about Drew's past but about his present fitness to serve. Then came the deeper cut, Nina. When Sasha pushed her to finally tell the truth about her affair with Drew, Nina hesitated. She knew the damage it would cause. But Michael was already listening. He didn't need her to confess anymore, he had heard enough. And that gave him a weapon far more personal than any political scandal. Drew hadn't just broken rules, he had broken hearts, families, and trust. Michael now had leverage to destroy Drew not just as a public figure, but as a man, a father, a partner. And he was going to use it. Curtis and Michael agreed. It had to happen at Drew's next press conference. A perfect storm. Drew had scheduled a high-profile media event, presumably to promote a new community development initiative tied to his so-called vision for Port Charles. The cameras would be rolling. The media would be watching. The town's most powerful families would be in attendance. And that was when the truth would be unleashed. Curtis and Michael would step forward with every piece of evidence. The footage. The financial records. The hotel receptionist's statement. Jacinda, if she agreed, would appear in person, detailing Drew's history with ketamine, the circumstances surrounding his use. The ways he had threatened and silenced those who knew too much. Michael would confirm Drew's affair with Nina and his deliberate isolation of Willow during her recovery. Curtis would speak to the manipulation of Portia and the deception surrounding Felicia's mission. Each man would play his part, and by the time they were done, Drew wouldn't just be politically destroyed, he would be publicly shamed. But this wasn't only about the moment of exposure. It was about the consequences that would follow. Once the truth was out, Drew would lose support from voters, colleagues, and donors. He would be investigated, shunned, and, if Curtis and Michael got their way, forced to resign under pressure. Perhaps even face criminal charges for some of his more underhanded tactics. It wouldn't just end Drew's campaign. It would erase his legacy, his influence, his ability to hurt anyone else. And yet, beneath the strategy, beneath the plan and the timing and the headlines to come, there was something deeper driving both men. For Curtis, it was about redemption. He had watched too many people in Port Charles suffer because others in power believed they were untouchable. He had watched the city tolerate corruption, tolerate deceit, because it came from men who looked clean in public. But Curtis had seen what lay beneath, and he refused to stay silent. For Michael, it was about justice, for Willow, for Wiley. For every moment stolen and every memory manipulated. Drew had pretended to be the solution, the support, the savior. But in reality, he had been the architect of chaos. And Michael could no longer allow that kind of darkness to operate unchecked. He owed it to his family. He owed it to himself. As the day of the press conference neared, the tension in Port Charles thickened. Drew, oblivious to the trap being set around him, continued rehearsing his speech, preparing his polished lines, believing he was about to cement his future. He had no idea that his past was about to catch up with him, on live television, with the people he had wronged standing just feet away. And when the moment came, when the spotlight turned, it would be Curtis and Michael, not Drew, who would hold the truth. Not in whispers. Not in threats. But in facts, in proof, in the unstoppable weight of revelation. Because some men fall quietly. And some fall with the entire town watching. And this fall, Drew's fall, would be one that Port Charles would never forget. Jason could feel it in his gut, something was spiraling out of control. And it all pointed back to Drew. The brother he once trusted, the man he believed could be redeemed after all they had lost, was now moving in a direction that terrified even Jason. There was no more denying it, Drew's decisions were no longer rooted in desperation or misguided loyalty. They were deliberate. Calculated. Obsessively controlled. And Jason, who had seen the darkest edges of power and manipulation before, recognized the signs all too clearly. Drew wasn't just walking a dangerous path, he was dragging others with him. And now, the one person standing closest to the flame was Michael. What had once been a tense but manageable rivalry between Michael and Drew had now ignited into something far more dangerous. It was no longer about power struggles or personal grudges, it had evolved into a full-scale psychological war. Drew had begun asserting himself in ways that shocked even Jason. He was no longer content to maneuver in shadows, he was forcing outcomes, pushing boundaries, manipulating people like chess pieces in a game only he understood. Jason had heard enough whispers around Port Charles, seen enough shifts in behavior, and received enough warnings to realize the gravity of what was coming. Drew's grip on control had become an obsession, and Jason feared that it was only a matter of time before it led to catastrophic consequences. Michael, for his part, had stopped waiting for answers and started taking action. The betrayal he felt, after discovering how Drew had deceived him, sabotaged his reunion with Willow in Germany. And manipulated people close to him, had turned into rage. He had tried to give Drew the benefit of the doubt, tried to keep the family peace. But that was over now. Michael was no longer looking for reconciliation, he was looking for retribution. The closer he got to the truth, the more determined he became to expose every lie Drew had built his empire upon. He wasn't just reacting to Drew's madness, he was preparing to match it with a storm of his own. Jason saw what was coming. Two powerful men, both fueled by betrayal, both unwilling to step down. And at the center of this explosion was a ticking time bomb, Drew's unchecked ambition. Jason had spent years navigating the underworld of Port Charles, dealing with mob bosses, corporate wars, and political spin, but never had he seen something quite like this. Drew was unraveling from within, and he was taking Michael's world with him. The danger wasn't just in what Drew was doing, it was in how unpredictable he had become. Jason could no longer anticipate his next move. That made him more dangerous than any criminal Jason had faced. The situation was growing increasingly unstable. Drew was planning press conferences, controlling narratives, eliminating obstacles with brutal efficiency. Meanwhile, Michael was weaponizing truth. Gathering allies, exposing secrets with surgical precision. What had begun as strategy had become personal. Every move was sharper, more aggressive, more volatile. Neither man trusted the other. Neither was willing to back down. And the collision that was coming wouldn't just end one career, it had the potential to shatter families, destroy alliances, and plunge Port Charles into a new kind of chaos. Jason, standing on the outside but deeply connected to both men, felt the crushing weight of inevitability. He knew he couldn't stop what was coming, but he could try to contain the damage. He warned Michael, Drew won't stop. Not until he owns everything. Not until every person who questioned him is either silenced or destroyed. But Michael didn't flinch. He looked Jason in the eye and said he was ready. He'd lost too much. Willow. His children's security. His peace. And he wouldn't let Drew take one more thing. If Drew wanted war, Michael was prepared to give it to him. The explosion had already begun. Port Charles could feel it in the air, in the tension at the Metro Court, in the guarded conversations at Crimson, in the silence hanging over the Corinthos mansion. And now, the question wasn't whether Drew and Michael would collide, it was how much of the town would survive when they did. One man clinging to power. One man demanding justice. Both unrelenting. Both dangerous. And Jason, caught between them, could only brace for the moment it all finally blew apart. Because the fuse had already been lit, and the detonation was inevitable. Drew had spent months crafting the perfect illusion, an image of authority, resilience, and control so meticulously built that even those closest to him began to believe it. But now, as cracks began to form in the foundation he so confidently stood upon, the fear started to seep in. Not the kind of fear that comes with external threats, but the deeper, more corrosive kind, the fear of exposure. Drew could feel it tightening around him like an invisible noose. He had pushed too far, crossed too many lines, and made too many enemies in the name of ambition. And now, those very choices were coming back for him, louder, faster, and more brutal than he ever anticipated. This wasn't just a bump in the road. This was the beginning of collapse. The pressure was mounting with every hour. Whispers of his past decisions had evolved into undeniable conversations. Curtis and Michael were no longer working in the shadows, they were coordinating, collecting, and preparing to reveal every ugly truth Drew had tried to bury. What once were calculated risks now looked like reckless mistakes. Paying off the hotel staff in Germany to mislead Willow, isolating her from Michael during a critical time in her recovery. Once seemed like a tactical maneuver. Now, it was evidence of manipulation. His affair with Nina, hidden under a veil of silence, now hung over him like a loaded weapon. Especially with Sasha pushing Nina to come clean. And worst of all, Drew realized that the very people he once tried to control, Michael, Curtis, even Jason, had stopped giving him the benefit of the doubt. They no longer saw him as misguided. They saw him as dangerous. This shift was unbearable. For a man who had built his entire resurgence on the illusion of control, Drew now found himself drowning in the consequences of his own unchecked actions. His every movement was scrutinized. Every motive questioned. Meetings that once felt like performances of power now felt like interrogations. He could see it in the eyes of his colleagues, in the measured tones of his former allies, in the sudden distance of people who once defended him. And for the first time, Drew couldn't silence the inner voice reminding him that this wasn't just paranoia, it was real. The fear manifested in ways he couldn't hide. He became more erratic, more forceful, trying to tighten his grip as everything slipped through his fingers. He called in favors that no longer had weight, demanded loyalty from people who were already turning away. He tried to keep his public image intact, rehearsing speeches, attending meetings, holding press conferences, but underneath it all, his composure was crumbling. Every time his phone rang, every time his name trended online, he braced himself for the moment the truth would break. Because deep down, he knew it wasn't a matter of if, it was a matter of when. And that inevitability became his torment. Drew began making rash decisions, doubling down on old lies, spinning new narratives to protect himself. But the more he fought to stay ahead of the storm, the faster it chased him. His mistakes weren't isolated. They were connected, forming a pattern that painted a picture too damning to ignore. The ketamine use, the manipulation of Portia, the covert tracking of Jacinda, the emotional sabotage of Willow and Michael. Every thread that Curtis and Michael pulled threatened to unravel everything. What terrified Drew the most wasn't just the public fallout. It was the personal reckoning. He had alienated those who once stood beside him. He had weaponized trust, distorted affection, and justified every betrayal as strategy. And now, he was alone. The alliances he had built on fear and obligation were fading. The fortress of secrecy he had hidden behind was collapsing. And no amount of press conferences or polished statements could protect him from the truth anymore. Drew had always believed he was in control, that he could navigate any crisis, outsmart any opponent. But he underestimated the strength of those who now stood against him. He never thought Michael would turn so completely. Never thought Curtis would abandon discretion. Never imagined that Jason, silent, steady Jason, would watch him unravel with such quiet resignation. And perhaps most damning of all, he never thought the sins he considered private would ever become so painfully public. Now, as the world he built begins to implode, Drew finds himself cornered not by his enemies, but by the reflection of the man he's become. The fear he carries is not only of being exposed, it's of being known. Known for what he truly is. Known for the damage he's caused. Known for the fact that everything he's done, every move he's made, has led to this very moment. The moment where control is no longer his, and consequences are no longer avoidable. And so Drew stands on the edge of his reckoning, the facade cracking, the fear visible, the truth inching closer. What once was ambition has now mutated into obsession. What once was strategy has now become a slow-motion downfall. And Port Charles watches, waiting for the moment when the man who thought he could control everything finally loses control of himself. Because this isn't just a scandal anymore. It's an implosion. It's a reckoning. It's a story of power, stripped bare. Drew's end did not arrive with a whisper. It came crashing down like a storm that had been brewing for far too long, violent, inevitable, and absolutely impossible to escape. For months, he had danced on the edge of ruin, intoxicated by the illusion of control. He believed that his secrets would remain buried, that his manipulations would go unnoticed, and that his ambition could be passed off as strategy. But now, with the truth erupting in every corner of Port Charles, Drew Kane found himself facing the very thing he thought he could outrun, the consequences of his own actions. And this wasn't just the collapse of a career. It was the complete dismantling of a man who believed himself untouchable. At first, the cracks were small, rumors, strange looks, questions that didn't have answers. But Drew kept pushing forward, burying one lie under another, refusing to believe that the life he built on half-truths and covert deals could ever fall apart. He dismissed Curtis's suspicions, underestimated Michael's fury, and ignored Jason's warnings. He convinced himself that everyone had something to hide, and that his sins were no greater than anyone else's. But what Drew failed to grasp was that he had crossed a line not even his closest allies could defend. He didn't just make political mistakes. He betrayed people. Deeply. Personally. And the town that once respected him had finally decided they'd had enough. Michael's decision to go public wasn't a spontaneous outburst of anger. It was a calculated move, one driven by heartbreak and justice. He had stood by silently as Drew distorted the truth, as he isolated Willow during her darkest moments. As he poisoned the spaces between family with secrets and deceit. But the moment Michael realized that Drew had paid a hotel staffer to keep him and Willow apart in Germany, something inside him snapped. It wasn't just about power anymore. It was about principle. And Michael knew that if Drew was allowed to continue, unchecked, he would only hurt more people. That realization became the fuel behind a movement, a plan to dismantle the carefully curated facade Drew had spent so long perfecting. Curtis, too, had seen enough. Drew's tactics had gone beyond desperate, they were predatory. Manipulating Portia. Hiring Felicia to dig into Jacinda's past. Using his influence to rewrite narratives and silence dissent. Curtis, who had tried to stay out of the fray for as long as possible, could no longer justify staying quiet. And when Michael approached him with evidence, timelines, and a growing coalition of voices ready to expose Drew, Curtis didn't hesitate. The line had been crossed. It was time to fight back. Together, Michael and Curtis set the stage. They gathered every piece of evidence, videos, recordings, testimonies, and chose their moment, Drew's upcoming press conference. A public platform Drew planned to use to elevate his image. To sell his latest policy proposal, to remind Port Charles of his authority. But instead, it would become the scene of his public execution, not in blood, but in truth. The day arrived. And the city buzzed with anticipation. The press gathered, unaware of what was about to unfold. Drew stood at the podium, polished and poised, completely blind to the storm behind the curtain. And then Michael stepped forward. The room fell into silence as he began to speak, not with vengeance, but with clarity. He laid out the facts, Drew's affair with Nina, the hotel payoff in Germany. The manipulation of Willow's treatment, the threats against Portia, the hiring of Felicia under false pretenses, the concealed history with ketamine. It was all there, laid bare before the public. And then Curtis stepped in, confirming every detail, presenting statements and timelines, even announcing that Jacinda had agreed to testify publicly. The reaction was immediate. Gasps, chaos. Reporters scrambling to verify the claims, Drew standing frozen as the walls of his empire crumbled around him. He tried to speak, but the words failed him. There was no defense. No spin that could reframe what had just been unleashed. And in that moment, Drew realized something devastating. This wasn't a smear campaign. This wasn't a coordinated political attack. This was truth. Unfiltered. Unapologetic. And completely inescapable. Over the following days, Drew's world collapsed with relentless speed. Donors withdrew. Allies cut ties. Public opinion turned vicious. Editorials questioned his mental stability, his moral compass, his legitimacy. Investigations were launched. Willow severed all communication. Jason remained silent. Not out of hatred, but out of bitter disappointment. And perhaps most crushing of all, even Nina, once his most dangerous secret, refused to defend him. She had her own scars. And Drew had used her as a pawn in a game she never agreed to play. The town that once applauded Drew now watched him unravel. There were no protests in his defense. No one begging for his redemption. Just quiet, collective acknowledgement that the man they once believed in had betrayed not only them, but himself. And the fear that began to consume Drew was no longer about scandal. It was existential. He had become everything he once claimed to fight against. And now, with nothing left to control, no more narratives to twist, no more people to manipulate. Drew Kane stood at the edge of a personal apocalypse of his own making. He withdrew from public life, retreating behind locked doors and legal counsel. But no press release, no legal statement. No performative apology could reverse what had been done. Because his downfall wasn't just political, it was moral. It was human. And it struck the heart of a community that no longer believed in the illusion he had built. And that is where the true end came. Not with shouts. Not with protests. But with silence. A deafening, condemning silence from a town that finally saw the truth. Drew Kane didn't fall because someone pushed him. He fell because, in the pursuit of power, he dug his own grave. And when the ground gave way beneath him, there was no one left to catch him. Only the weight of his own choices. And the memory of what he used to be.